YouTube. To continue on a similar topic of another recent video I created about the meaning of words, that video looking at the word nation and nationalism, we now come to the word church, another very common word that most people have heard of, used, or are familiar with to whatever degree. But this time, we are not going to simply look at the meaning of the word from the standpoint of a dictionary. However, we will quickly review what the definition is. That is not necessarily what we will focus on in this video, which is interesting because why would you do that? What kind of nonsense is a video about the meaning of words but not focusing on the word's actual definition from a dictionary? Well, I think it would be interesting to look at the word, in this case, in the context of its translation, origin, and biblical intent. To put it simply, even knowing the definition of the word, which really hasn't changed in this case, are we always using the correct term or understand its actual context? So my questions are around what was the word translated from and what was its intended context from a biblical standpoint? Meaning, are we actually using and thinking about the term in its appropriate context? Similar to the word nation, my belief is that people use the word church as a vague term. I would argue to most people, church could simply just mean institution or place of worship. However, hopefully by the end of this video, we will demonstrate, in many cases, a more proper understanding of the word church in its original context should be more along the lines of a group of Christians or an assembly of believers. One would think this is obvious, but I'm not so sure that this is the case. Let's start by demonstrating how most people use the word today in the context of its use in everyday conversations. Let me also say that this is just based on my anecdotal experience, but my contention, again, is that most people only use the word church in the context of institution, denomination, building, or place of worship. So, let's start by looking at what a simple Google search of the word church and definition, what does that pull up? Well, the first thing that pulls up is Oxford Languages, very similar to the word nation, not necessarily Wikipedia, which is off to the right here. And the dictionary for Oxford Languages pulls up church, a building used for public Christian worship. And then it uses it as a verb. Take a woman who has recently given birth to church for a service of thanksgiving. That's very common definition. Wikipedia, a church building, or church house is a building used for Christian worship services and other Christian religious activities. The earliest identified Christian church is a house church founded between 233 AD and 256 AD. So, this is what most people think and use the word church for. In addition, we always think of church and Christianity, at least, in the reference point from Protestantism. I'm going to be addressing this from a Protestant standpoint, not getting into Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. But in the United States, a lot of people, when they think of Christianity, they think of it in terms of a Christian denomination. Well, what is a Christian denomination? A Christian denomination is a distinct religious body within Christianity that comprises all church congregations of the same kind, identifiable by traits. And you can go down here and have a list of Christian denominations. You have the Methodist organization and institution. You have the Presbyterian, PCA, and USA institutions, on and on, yada, yada. And just like in the prior video around nation and nationalism, I'm actually going to pull up an older dictionary just to show that the word really hasn't changed that much. From the Webster's Collegiate Dictionary from 1919. I've already got it pulled up. Here's the Library of Congress, image 220 of Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, and I've zoomed in multiple times. Here's the word church. Here it's telling you some of the etymology the Lord's house, and then it goes to number 1, a building for public Christian worship. However, it expands the definition much further than this definition from the Oxford Languages Dictionary. This one actually uses it in a different context. Christians collectively, the whole body of Christ followers, a body of Christian believers of the same creed, rites, and ecclesiastical authority. A denomination, as the church at Ephesus, the Roman Catholic Church. Number 4, organized Christianity, as in a nation. Ecclesiastical power, there's nation again. The clerical profession, church service, divine worship, any body of worshipers. So this is actually a much more expansive definition than simply a place of worship or just, a religious institution, which is the way that I argue most people use the word and the term church. Again, going back to a modern definition, Wikipedia, Oxford Languages, Merriam-Webster's, church, actually went to Merriam-Webster's, a building for the number 1. So if you look at the modern website, Merriam-Webster, you pull up church, number 1, a building for public and especially Christian worship. Number 2, the clergy or officialdom of a religious body. Number 3, the whole body of Christians. That seems to be going back to the actual original definition of the word, or a more, another intended use of the word. Maybe not necessarily the original definition of the word. Number 4, a public divine worship. Number 5, the clerical profession. Scrolling down even further, of or relating to a church. So I'm not really arguing or debating that the definition of the word has actually changed very much. I would argue that this looks slightly different from this original definition here from the 1919 Merriam's, or not Merriam, but just Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. But a simple Google search, Oxford Languages, is pulling up a very narrow definition of the word, a building used for Christian worship. But even if you go to Merriam-Webster's, again, the first thing that pulls up is a building for Christian worship. So I think we've demonstrated the understanding and intended definition of the word, as in modern use, is that most people use this word when they say church to mean a place of public worship, a religious institution of a Christian denomination, or a place, a building for a place of worship. So that's not really what I think is interesting about this word. And we can even use a couple of I've got Bible Gateway pulled up. I pulled up the church, entered it in, and I know there are KJV only people out there. That's fine. You can do the same thing in the KJV, but I'm gonna just use the NIV version. I don't think that's a terrible translation. But even reading some Bible verses, just as an example, the word seems to be appropriate for the most part. Reading one of the first Bible verses that comes up, Matthew 16:18. And this is a verse I actually want to hone in on, because we'll get back to this verse a little later in the video. But Matthew 16:18, very famous verse. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. So that's a good example. That word seems to work there. You can read another Bible verse, just scrolling down a little bit, Matthew 18:17. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. So again, this seems to be not really a lot of confusion. Tell it to the church, tell it to the institution, tell it to the denomination, or whatever you want to call it. the way that most people think in a modern context seems to work for a lot of these verses. However, if you keep reading a lot of verses, well, maybe not a lot of verses on this page that's been pulled up, but it's not always clear that it's actually referring to just simply a place of worship or an institution of leadership or something like that. Here are a few interesting verses to think about that we're going to get into. Acts 8:3, right here. But Paul began to destroy the church, going from house to house. He dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. Okay, well, how was Paul destroying the church? He was collecting people from their houses and putting them in prison. You cannot imprison physically in a cage an institution or a place of worship. In this case, this is a different context of the word, I would argue. You can read another verse, for an example, Acts 14:27. On arriving there, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. On arriving there, they gathered the church together. How do you gather an institution or a place of worship together? You can't gather a place of worship. It's a physical place. It's a building. How do you gather an institution, if nothing else, by gathering the assembly of believers, gathering the collective believers that are the church, that make up the church? So here again, I would argue the context of this word is not an institution or, some vague term for a denomination or, a building or place of worship. This is talking about the individual, a gathering of the assembly of believers, the born-again believers who follow Christ, gathering them together. That's what this seems to be saying. And it's not, regardless, this sounds and seems to be in a different context as some of these other verses. So it's just not, it seems like this one word has many different uses, and where it really starts to get a little interesting is when you actually look up the origins of this word, the etymology of the word, but even more interesting, what was this word translated from the Greek text? That's where it gets even more interesting. So let's look up the etymology of the word church. Again, I'm just doing a simple Google search. Etymology of the word church seems to come from Old English. I'm not even going to try to pronounce some of this stuff. Related to Dutch, Kirk, I guess. I lied. I tried to, pronounce some of these words. In German, a German word based on a medieval Greek. Not going to try to pronounce that. From Greek, I'm not going to try to pronounce that either, which seems to me Lord's house, something along those lines. You can scroll down. What is the origin of the word church? It is probably derived from Old English Circia, I think that's how you pronounce that, which in turn came from the German Kurikia, I don't know how you pronounce it again, which likely came from the Greek. I'm not going to try to pronounce that because I've probably already butchered a lot of other words, which means of the Lord. Interesting. That doesn't necessarily seem like it means church, building or institution or something like that, but it's also not necessarily meaning that it doesn't mean that either. You can also go to the etymology here. This is an online etymological dictionary. Again, coming from an Old English word, place of assemblage set aside for Christian worship. What I want to highlight is this is actually interesting. The body of Christian believers. Well, really, this is two different things. A place of worship is different from the people who go there. Because today we would call this a church and we would call this a congregation. Based on modern conversation. But, this word seems to come from Old English, maybe even some of these Greek words, of the Lord. Again, there's that word. But I actually pulled up a really interesting article that's from 2020. I don't know how reputable this article is, but I thought it brought up some interesting points, and all of the links to these things will be in the description below. But reading through this a little bit, here's where it starts getting into some of the good stuff about the word. The word church has a complicated history. It is probably derived from Old English, which in turn came from the German, which likely came from the Greek, which means of the Lord. Again, that doesn't really seem like church simply meant or was intended to only ever mean, a building or place of worship or an institution. We think of these churches today. What does that remind you of? A building with, a not-for-profit tax status from the IRS, with leadership and admins and secretaries and deacons and pastors and budgets and philanthropy organization, or outreaches and Sunday school classrooms and things like that, which I'm not saying that's an inaccurate definition of the word, but when you get into the actual history of the word, I think it's a little more complicated than that, especially from its intended biblical use. So here again, some scholars dispute this, saying that our English word derives from the Anglo-Saxon kirke, I don't even know, again, I'm probably butchering all this, which in turn comes from the Latin, looks like circus, meaning circle or ring, because early congregations gathered in a circle. Again, when you start looking at the origins of this word, it really doesn't seem to mean a lot of times how we use it in everyday conversation. Here's where it gets really interesting though. The oldest word for church, the word that St. Paul himself used, is the Greek word ekklesia, from which we get the terms ecclesial and ecclesiastical. The word was in use centuries before the Christian church appeared on the scene. It referred to a socio-political gathering of citizens who were called together to attend the concerns of the city. This is where my contention comes in for the actual original biblical intent for the word. It seems to be a lot of places where Bible verses have been translated to use the word church. Most people assume that just means, that could just mean a place of worship, or simply, the Christian organization or whatever organization was, in Ephesus at the time, the Church of Ephesus. Well, the church obviously went to a building and probably had, administrators and all this other kind of stuff. That seems to be the context that most people think of the word church. What I'm arguing is a lot of times the word church should actually really mean a gathering of Christians, an assembly of believers assembling together to worship and have fellowship, or, learn, or what have you. So taking this article, mentioning what Paul actually used, or what was actually in the Greek and what it was translated from, again, this is a simple Google search. What was church translated from in the original text? Here you go. It's the first thing that's pulled up. It's already highlighted. Paul himself used in the Greek the word ekklesia, from which we get the terms ecclesial and ecclesiastical. The word was in use centuries before the Christian church appeared on the scene. It referred to a socio-political gathering of citizens. There you go. There's also a pretty interesting article here. Should ecclesia really be translated as church in the Bible? This is the question. I'm not asking this question because, church has multiple meanings. What I'm arguing in this video is that most people, they're not using the correct meaning for the term all the time. They're just using this blanket term in the same context when they talk, think, and look at Christianity from a church perspective. So I'm not arguing translation, really. I'm just saying, because words can have multiple meanings. However, most people think of the context of this word as simply a religious institution, when I'm arguing that's not necessarily the case. That's not the same thing as an assembly of people. What I'm saying is you could have 10 Christ-following, Christ-loving believers meet in someone's attic, and that is a church. There's the church worshiping. That's a church. Especially if there's a pastor there or something like that, I'm not saying you can't, there's no hierarchical system of leadership. What I am saying is a church should also be thought of as an assembly of believers. And going back to this Bible verse here, Matthew 16:18, where I think it really gets interesting is when you look up how was this Greek translated into English? What did this actually look like in the Greek? Matthew 16:18. Well, let's look it up. Bible Hub pulls it up, and it's already kind of highlighted because I've already looked this up. Clicking here, well, here's Matthew 16:18. This is Strong's Concordance. Here's the Greek on the left. Here's the English on the right. And here's the verse. I also now to you say that you are Peter, and on this, the rock, I will build my church. And the gates of Hades not will prevail against it. Obviously translations are not going to be, exact from one language to the next, especially from an ancient language to a modern language. But here's the word, church. Well, there's ecclesian right here. What does this word mean? Well, let's look it up. The basic meaning of the Greek ekklesia is assembly or gathering. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The actual context that you should think of this verse, seems to me, from a historical perspective, is not now you're going to have Roman Catholicism and all of its leadership and hierarchies and Vaticans and all, Vatican I and Vatican II and all that, and Eastern Orthodoxy and the Magisterium and Protestantism and various denominations and things like that. This should not be thought of as I will build my religious institution, man-made religious institution. I would argue, and I will build my gathering or assembly of believers. That is a more literal, accurate translation, in my opinion. And so, therefore, my contention is not necessarily in this case, going back to the original topic of the video, this is a definition of the word church. However, when you read the Bible in an everyday conversation as a Christian, you shouldn't necessarily only ever think of church in the meaning of place of worship, religious institution, yada yada. I would argue in many cases it should simply just mean the assembling of gathering of born again, Christ loving, Christ following believers. That is my argument. That is my contention. I hope this was helpful for anybody. I hope this was interesting. And I thank anybody for listening to this. Please subscribe.